saying?
Only you, Jim. Only you. Well, today we're going to start in the book of Joshua. And so if you have, hopefully, some of you might have got ahead. I know you have a lot to do with other classes and that, but reading Joshua is where the Pentateuch leaves off, and Joshua picks up the narrative and starts leading the children of Israel finally into the promised land. They have just come out of their 40-year experience in the wilderness, and they're getting ready to enter into the promises of God. Joshua is divided into two parts. The first part relates to the 7-year conquest of Canaan, and the second part is all about the division of the conquest of Canaan. In other words, the lands they conquered, they divide them up and give them to not all of the tribes, but to most of the tribes. There are still some tribes that need to conquer more of the land. First 5 chapters of the book record the spiritual, moral, and physical and military preparation of Joshua and the people for the conquest of Canaan. And the Joshua, of course, being a man of faith. And as you know, if you've been around long enough, you know that Joshua and Caleb were the two that came back and gave a good report. And so those were the only 2 out of the 12 spies that were allowed to go into the promised land. And he hesitates to send spies until being prompted by God to send 2 into the land. And of course we know those 2 went in to spy out Jericho and what was going on there. Joshua stages their initial assault in the central region of Canaan, serving to separate the northern and southern cities and tribes of Canaan. So it's a very strategic ploy, because he goes in at the middle and then works his way down, conquers, and then works his way north. This divide and conquer strategy provides a successful campaign of conquest, and so we know that Joshua uses this motive so that he can overcome the land. Of course, the first major challenge was the city of Jericho, and even though it was successful, the sin of Achan and the defeat of Ai taught them they must continue to obey God, and we'll go into that in a little bit more detail in a few moments. The deception by the Gideonites, we'll talk about that today, and what they did and how they accomplished it. In the final half of the book, an aging Joshua is instructed to divide the land among the tribes of Israel, and of course the final 2 chapters record the fulfilled promises of God. Now, if you were to look in Joshua, you would see chapters 1, 13, and 7 is the focus is for the conquest of Canaan. Chapters 13, 8 through 24 is the settlement in Canaan. And so the different topics are entering Canaan, conquering Canaan, preparation and subjection. And that's in chapters 1 through 13, and chapters 13, 8 to 24 is the dividing possession. The place is the Jordan River in chapter 1 through 13, and it's 2.5 tribes are on the east of Jordan and 9.5 tribes on the west of Jordan. Total time frame in chapter 13 is 18 years, but chapter 1 through 13 is, on the first part, there's only 1 month, but the second part is a 7-year conquest. So it takes a long time. It doesn't happen overnight, but yet God gives them the land little by little. Now, here we're going to discuss just a little bit about each item, and it'll give you the reference here so you understand what we're talking about, and then when you go and read through Joshua, it'll give you a clearer picture of what we're talking about. Israel, in part 1, the conquest of Canaan, which is chapter 1 through 13 chapters, and verse 7. The first one is in chapter 1 through to verse 18, is we see Joshua replaces Moses as the leader. Moses cannot enter into Canaan because of a mistake he made before the children of Israel. When they were going through the wilderness, they got to a place where there was no water, and God told Moses to go out and speak to the rock. Now, in a previous occasion, Moses went out and the Lord said, smite the rock, and out came water, and it was in a dry place. And when he smote the rock, out came water, and they fed their cattle water, and plus had water for themselves. But what God was trying to show the people, that he was in control or in charge of what was going on, he told Moses the second time, which was the second circumstance later in the life while they were in the wilderness, to speak to the rock. But you see, the reason why this was all happening is because the children of Israel were being nasty and talking against God and murmuring and complaining because they had no water. And so God wanted to prove that he was the one that was leading. And so he said, you know, Moses, speak to the rock. But Moses, in his anger at the children of Israel, not at God, but at the children of Israel, went out and smote the rock twice. And because of his disobedience, God said, you're not going into the promised land. He said, I will allow you to see it, but you cannot enter into it. And so when we read, we find out at the last of Moses, before Moses dies, that he goes out into the mountain and he sees the promised land. He does not step a foot in it because of his disobedience. So in chapter 2, verses 1 to 5, we see Joshua prepares Israel militarily. So he begins to prepare them because of the conquest. They need to know and be prepared. You just don't go out and fight a war without doing some practicing. You do some preparations. You make sure your armor is in top-notch condition. You make sure you have enough, let's talk today. You make sure you have enough bullets. In Joshua's day, they made sure they had enough arrows or enough spears, and they made sure their swords were sharp. And so he does prepare them to do all the things. But we see in chapter 5, from 2 to 12, that Joshua prepares Israel spiritually. Why does Joshua need to prepare the children of Israel spiritually? We look back into Moses. You see, when God called Moses the first time, it was after he was in the land of Midian and had married the woman, the Ethiopian woman, and had gone and had 2 children. And then God called Moses to go back into Egypt to lead the children of Israel out. And when he did, we find that Moses' wife, Zipporah, has to take a sharp knife and circumcise her own 2 sons. Because even though Moses knew better, he never performed the Abrahamic law or covenant with his own family. This was a promise between God and Abraham that all of the children would be circumcised. Abraham did not do that. And we see how that reflects in his leadership. Because when he's leading the children of Israel out into the wilderness and for the 40 years because of disobedience, we find out that when Joshua goes into the promised land, what happens? What's the first thing he has to do? Because you see, while they were in the wilderness, all those that were part of the group that denied God and wouldn't go into the promised land, they all died. And their children that were born unto them, Moses had gotten lax concerning the Abrahamic promises, or the Abrahamic covenant, which is circumcision. And we see that here Joshua prepares the children of Israel spiritually because he has to take and circumcise all of the men that were born in the wilderness to fulfill the covenant that God had made with Abraham. And so we see Joshua prepares Israel spiritually, and it's called the Hill of Foreskins. And he circumcised all of the men. And we see how something as simple as that reflected later on in Moses' life, even though Moses was one of the greatest leaders in Israel's day. In chapter 5, verse 13 through 15, we see the commander of the Lord appears. In this case, we know that this is a theophany of God revealing himself to Joshua to let him know that he was going to fight the battle for Israel. The next thing we see is the conquest of Canaan by Israel. The conquest of central Canaan, which is in chapter 6, verse 1 through 8 to 35. The conquest of southern Canaan is in chapter 9, verses 1 through 10, verse 43. And the conquest of northern Canaan is chapter 11, 1 through 15. The whole conquest of Canaan is summarized in chapter 11, 16 to 12, and verse 24. And then, of course, the last part is the unconquered parts of Canaan, which is in chapter 13, 1 through 7. The settlement of Canaan. Okay, now the settlement east of the Jordan. The geographical boundaries is in chapter 13, verse 8 through 13, and tribal boundaries are in chapter 13 from 14 to 33. When we look at this, we understand that there were 2.5 tribes who did not want to go over Jordan. They wanted to stay on the other side of Jordan. They wanted to, there was land there for them that they had conquered. There was grass for them. There was water for them. And so therefore they said, we don't want to go over. We want to stay here. And those are the tribes of, half tribe of Manasseh and Gad and Reuben. And so we see that there's 2.5 tribes that stay on the other side of Jordan. They do not enter into the promised land. We also see that when they approached Moses about it, that Moses said to them, what are you trying to do? Weaken the hands of the rest of the children of Israel? What are you trying to do? Don't you remember what happened when the 12 spies went in? And I'm paraphrasing it, but he was saying the same thing, because here there were some children who did not want to enter into the full promises of God, which were on the other side of Jordan. They were happy to stay on this side. It's almost like today where people will come into the church and they're happy to do this, that, and the other, but they won't enter in all the promise of God. Some people will say, oh, well, it's okay, I repented, I'm saved. Instead of being baptized in Jesus' name for the remission of sins and being filled with the Holy, they don't want to enter into the full promises that God has given them. So they're satisfied, or they're happy with what they have on this side of Jordan and not going into the full promises of God. And that's exactly what happened with the half tribe of Manasseh, Gad, and Reuben. They didn't want to receive they were happy with what they had, even though God had more for them. That's kind of sad to me, because I personally, I want everything God's got. And if you don't want yours, I'll take yours too. So all you got to do is just tell him, say, I don't want it, Lord, give it to Brother Beek, he'll have it. That's fine, I'll take it. But you know, that's the way the rest of the tribes they were in. And so we see that they do go in and they conquer. And then when they have conquered, the half tribe of Manasseh, Reuben and Gad go back to the other side of Jordan. We also see that after they settle the west side of Jordan, that there's also a religious community. There's places that are set aside for the Levites. So, some of the Levites, all the priests, their living is by the children of Israel, and they work in the synagogues and that, and so they're there. Also included in that religious community are 6 cities of refuge that are going. And of course, as they begin to grow, those cities of refuge go even more. And a city of refuge was for a place for somebody who killed somebody, not intentionally. But let's say they were out in the field and the size fell out of their hand and hit somebody in the heart or something and killed them unintentionally. Then what that person would do was go to that city of refuge, and he would explain everything to the men of that place. And then when the avenger of blood, and whenever the avenger of blood would come, the city would protect him. The avenger of blood, do you understand what that is? I can give it to you in a quick summarization. The avenger of blood was usually the next of kin of the one that was slain. So if somebody was killed, then his brother or his cousin or his uncle or his dad or whoever was the next one that was in kin would go out and kill the one who had killed him. And the avenger of blood would never be held accountable because he killed the one who killed him. And so that's why he's called the avenger of blood. But it was always the next of kin or the closest relative that was classified as the avenger of blood, who could go out and kill the slayer without any repercussions. But in the case where it was accidental, then the one who had killed somebody accidentally would go to a city of refuge. They would investigate his circumstances, and then they would protect him here. And that the slayer would stay in that city until either the high priest died or there was a priest that came with Urim and Thummim. And don't ask me what the Urim and Thummim is, because I do not know. I have searched for it. I'm trying to figure out what it is. I just have not found the right theological study on it to find out exactly what it talks about when it says the Urim and Thummim. So if you have that information, please give it to me. It's something I've been curious about, and I have searched for on numerous occasions. When I have some free time, I will look it up. The settlement of Israel is completed in chapter 21, verses 43 to 45. There's conditions for the continued settlement. The altar of witnesses, blessings of God come through only obedience. And in chapter 24, 29, 33, Joshua and Eliezer died. Okay. Now, here's a few notes on the preparation that you have gone, and I've already said a few things, and we're just going to touch on them again, but we're going to go into a little bit more detail. Faithful to leadership. One of the key things about Joshua we find in his life is that he was faithful to leadership. When you read about him in Moses and Leviticus, Deuteronomy, it was always Joshua who was with Moses. It was always Joshua who was serving Moses. It was Joshua who stayed in the temple. Even when Moses left, Joshua stayed in the temple. So we see something in Joshua's life that was different than the rest of the children of Israel, because he had a desire for the things of God. And we see that in Joshua's life. When Moses comes down from the mountain and breaks the tablets, it's Joshua who speaks up and says, you know, let's go and destroy all these people. And all these things. It's Joshua who is seen to be faithful. And this is one thing that is very key in anybody's life, even including today, is God chooses people. You may not be the best speaker, you may not be the best singer, but if you are faithful, then God will choose you to be responsible in leadership and other areas of your life that God chooses. And God puts an anointing on people who are faithful. He becomes chosen for leadership. Joshua distinguished himself while many of the people were given over to idolatry and worship of golden calf. Joshua is not among the idolaters. And we know that because Joshua is actually with Moses up on the mount, and he's there with him. And when Moses comes down, he's the one who discloses that, you know, they need to destroy. Joshua is loyal to leadership. We see that because he was not among the idolaters, but he was mentoring future leaders. And when we see that they choose the 12 spies to go into the children of, into Israel, into Canaan for the children of Israel, that Joshua is one of the ones who comes back with a good report. Joshua and Caleb were the only 2 out of the 12. That says a lot about human nature, you know that? We are quicker to grab a hold of something that's negative and discuss something that's negative than we are to discuss things that are positive. Have you ever noticed that? We are quicker to, really, they did that? I can't believe it. And we're quicker to grab a hold of that because it's negative. But if they say, oh wow, did you see what so-and-so did? They just built this, and oh yeah, whatever. But if it's negative, oh wow, really? Tell me more. And we're quicker to grab a hold of it. And that's the same thing that happens with the children of Israel here. But we see that there's still 2, and that's Joshua and Caleb, who stay faithful to the leadership and say, you know, we are able. Yes, there's giants. They see all the same giants as everybody else. Because you can look at a giant one way. You can look at a negative and say, wow, he's too big to conquer. Or you can look at a positive and say, when he falls over, he's going to knock 10 others down with him. You can look at it two ways. It's your choice. We can see the giant and say we can conquer him, or we can see the giant and say, I'm running the other way. Joshua chose to see it and conquer. He was dedicated in his leadership. Joshua was dedicated to the house of God and to the work of the Lord. He was a frequent resident of the tabernacle, and he loved the house of God. There's something that is powerful in any young man or woman's life when there's a dedication to the house of God. I am so pleased when I see people who start coming to church that are faithful and dedicated. I know people who attend our church in Edinburgh, if they can change a shift during the week so they won't have to work on Sunday, they'll do it so they can be in the house of God. If they can change their shift so they can be in prayer meeting, they'll do it just so they can be in prayer meeting. There's something about that dedication that affects your future life, but not only affects your future life, but affects the lives of those all around about you. Even in my own life, I remember going through a rough time, and I got stuck in a job that really caused me to be out of the church, and that was for about 6 months, and it was the worst time of my life, in my spiritual life, and this was many years ago. And I remember my wife and I, because I had promised that I'd work for the guy for 1 year, and I'd done it, and I kept my word because I'm a man of my word. But you know, it really hurt me. And I remember when we left that job and we moved from that province to another province, we moved from New Brunswick to Ontario, I looked at my wife on the way, I said, I don't care what my boss says. If it's church night, I am not working. And God gave me a job with a man that he would come to me and say, oh, John, can you work overtime tonight? I said, no, can't, it's church night. He said, okay, no problem. I never had to worry because, as you see, I made that statement, I will not. And God would have to give me a job because I'd quit. I wasn't planning on leaving my walk with God. I needed it because it hurt me so much before. And so therefore, I would have done anything I possibly could to be in church, to be with other people, to worship God. And so we see that in the dedication here in Joshua. And God is looking for that dedication in some young man, young woman. And no, it doesn't have to be. When I say young man, young woman, you're only as young as you feel or as young as you want to be. Because I started in the full-time ministry when I was 42. So I wasn't that young. And the fact of the matter is, I was involved in ministerial work all for 20-some years prior to that, but actually became a licensed minister when I was 42. And that's fine, because you see, God ordains everything for a purpose. Also, we see that Joshua had a passion in leadership. On one occasion, while Israel was camped in the wilderness, there were 2 Hebrews out in the camp prophesying on their own, away from the 70 elders gathered at the tabernacle. And Joshua, designed to protect the integrity of the house of the tabernacle, called for them to be censored. And Moses noted his passion for the right, but did not agree with Joshua's judgment. And yes, you can see that, especially in younger people. No offense, Samantha, I'm not saying, but in younger people, you'll see that passion. Let's go do this. Come on, let's go. And as a seasoned minister, we got to say, hold a minute, Samantha. Let's just step back for a minute. If you do that, this is going to happen. But you can do that, but let's do it this way. And so you can take and you can connect passion, and as long as you have that passion, but you allow the leadership to work in your life, then you can accomplish the things you want to do, and with the energy you want to do it. I wish I had somebody to talk to me like this when I was young in the ministry, because I had that passion, and I made so many mistakes, it was ridiculous. But the fact is, I had that passion to do that, and God sees that passion, and He loves that passion. And God will use you for that passion, the same as He did Joshua. But the fact of the matter is, you need to listen to the elders that are around about you. Because when you read through the Word of God, we can see where young kings stood up and took over kingships. And because they wouldn't listen to the elders, but took and listened to the younger ones that had the same passion as them, they ended up making mistakes and causing damage instead of listening to the seasons. Okay, understand? And so we see that in Joshua, and Moses draws Joshua back and says, oh, Joshua, no. I'd rather everybody would prophesy in references. If you read that, you'll find out that's what Moses does. In other words, he sees that passion in Joshua, but he hauls it back and says, no, no, we're not going to condemn them. I want everybody, I wish everybody would prophesy like this throughout the whole camp. But he sees the passion for the protect the leadership. Now also, we also see the responsibility in leadership. When all the spies that entered Canaan are named in Scripture, very few have made the effort to remember them. Any student of the Bible can name the 2 men who gave a positive report of faith, Joshua. You know that's true. Can you tell me the other names of the other 10 spies? Huh? No, but you can tell me Joshua and Caleb. No problem. You remember that. So we see responsibility and leadership affects future generations. We know that what he did and what they did here, it not only affected their life, but it affected the lives of those that came after them. Even today it affects us. Joshua and Caleb were resolved that God would give them the land regardless of the obstacles. The people were swayed by majority. And there's an old saying, men can have their say, but men will not always have their way. You understand that?
Can have their way?
No, no. Men can have their say, but men will not always have their way. In other words, you can be swayed by the majority and follow the majority and do what the majority says, and even when it's wrong, God will honor it. But God's going to do what he wants to do, whether he does it through you or he has to wait for somebody else to come along. And so that's what I mean. Men can have their say, but will not always have. God, in the end, will have his way, whether it's through you or through somebody else. And here we see that Joshua and Caleb, they still stood for it. There was a responsibility, even in the face of all those other ones. Can you imagine telling them, what do you think, you young pups, what do you think you're doing? You're crazy, we can't go. And they stood and said, no way, we can do this. And so we see that, but the people are always swayed by the majority. And there's always that one person who stands out there in faith and says, we can do it. They're the ones that are usually put in the box and shoved into the corner of the room and left there to stay. But if it's of God, I'm going to tell you right now, God will have his way. Joshua and Caleb were exempted from the death sentence of the desert and promised, and they would enter it. All of the men, all the 10 spies, and all of the men from 20 years of age and upward died in the wilderness. All of those who were swayed and chose not to go into the promises of God, every one of them died in the wilderness, except for Joshua and Caleb. Those were the only 2, because they were not swayed. And even though some people don't see your vision, some people don't see what you feel God wants you to do, if you'll be responsible and don't lose your dream, then you will find out that God will have his way. Maybe a while, but it will happen. Sometimes you have to remain faithful even when the polls are against you. Conviction brings reward. And minority always becomes a majority. You look at Joshua. He became the leader. And he got to see all the beautiful things that God had to promise for him. When you refuse to give in to unbelief and fear, there is a promise of faith. Years and years ago, when I first came into church, God showed me some things. And I told him to my wife, and I said, there's no way it's ever going to happen, because I was looking at my circumstances of that day. But we stayed faithful. And I even had one of my pastors look at me one day and say, you'll never be a preacher. And I went home and cried and I wept and I said, God, if I'm not going to be a preacher, then why have you put this in my heart? Why do you torment me like this? And I just said, but I know whatever. And that same man one day came to me and apologized.
Why would he tell you? You never
That was
hear
my
people.
pastor. That happens. But the fact of the matter is, you may feel like you're the minority, but you actually become the majority. Here I am now, not just a pastor, not just a licensed minister, but also missionary, traveling around, preaching in more churches than my pastor ever did. Not saying that braggingly, but the fact that God used me and gave me what things that He showed me. 35 years ago, God showed me things, and He's still doing some of them today. And I'm just so excited to be a part of it. But I've never lost that dream He gave me, that desire He gave me. I've not lost sight of it, nor have I lost it in my heart. It's still there. And when you refuse to give in to unbelief and fear, and there is a promise of faith, you shall live. You shall become the majority, not the minority. And so therefore, I mean, this man, like I said, he apologized. He knew he had made a mistake. And I know why he did it, because he wanted to keep me for himself. That's what his whole premises. And that's a sad thing, because you cannot just keep people for yourself. You've got to let people go and do the work of the Lord, if you know that that's the case. So we see that he remains faithful. His conviction is rewarded because he becomes the leader. And he goes from being the minority to being the leader of the greatest majority, because now they're going to go into the promised land. And so we see that Israel accepts the transference of leadership from Moses to Joshua. And number one, when we need to seek God when it comes to the transferring of leadership in every aspect, even in a church setting. We need to know that this is the will of God, and we need to pray, we need to fast, we need to make sure that what's going on is the will of God, because a lot of people can get in a lot of hurt because of improper preparation for transfer. But we see that Moses transfers leadership to Joshua. And in Numbers 13, verse 16, we see that Joshua's name was changed from Hosea to Osea, I think it's how Osea is changed to Joshua. Joshua actually means salvation. Jesus is a derivative of Joshua. Jehovah, Joshua, Jesus all mean the same thing. Our dependence must be upon God, and we can do this through this. We cannot save anyone, but neither could Joshua, but Yahweh is salvation. There are three prominent men named Joshua in Scripture. The first was Joshua, son of Nun. The second is the priest Joshua, who was with Zerubbabel. And finally, Jesus, delivered priest, king, who came to the earth to provide salvation for all mankind. Each brought a message of salvation and deliverance. Joshua, who we're talking about, brought conquest of the promised land. Joshua, that was with Zerubbabel, he helped in the restoration of the temple. And, of course, Jesus was the commencement of the kingdom of heaven. Preparing people for battle, which we talked about a little bit earlier. We got to remember that children of Israel were not a trained fighting force. They were just slaves from Egypt. They had to be prepared to take up the battle. And in leadership, Joshua saw all this because he spent time with God and with Moses. And it's the same thing with us today. We need to prepare our people for battle. Even though it's not a battle that's physical anymore, in leadership we need to prepare people for a spiritual battle. When the two spies went into Jericho, we see also that